We're going to be finishing up Acts chapter 22 and then going into chapter 23 this evening. We have Paul at this time is under the protection, under arrest of the chief captain at this time. The reason for that is we saw a few chapters back that Paul had arrived in Jerusalem, and upon hearing that he was there were many Jews that came up against Paul, were very upset with him, making claim of him doing things that he didn't actually do, just being outright against it. So they created a mob that was beating Paul, and the chief captain comes, breaks it up, and takes Paul out of that. Last week we looked at Paul's message. He basically gives a testimony of his faith and of the hand of God, the will of God in his life. And at the end of that, we see that the Jews that were there, they had listened to it, but at the end of it, they reject the gospel, and they're all up in arms yet again to be caught for the death of Paul, simply out of their religious anger, I guess you could say. So let's go ahead and have a word of prayer and get started. Lord, I'm thankful to be here this evening and to yet again be in your word, and for the dedication of each of those to be here this evening, Lord, to be in your word as well. Pray you just guide and direct us as we're going through it. Please help us to remain attentive to it. I ask that you would guide, direct me as well. Let everything be for your honor, your glory, and your will. In Jesus' name, amen. Starting in verse 24 of Acts chapter 22, verse 24 of Acts chapter 22, we see this takes place right after when they call for the death of Paul after his message. It says, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? We see, because of the uproar, yet again the chief captain takes Paul away from the situation. He takes him within the castle, and because of what's taking place and the uproar that's taking place, he decides that he needs to get to the bottom of what's causing it. Why are these people so upset with him? We saw in the beginning of it that he thought Paul to be an Egyptian that had caused problems previously and to be causing all of these things to be taking place. And so he brings him in, and he gives them the soldiers instructions to begin scourging Paul, or whipping Paul, basically torturing him to get information from him to figure out what's going on. Why are these people mad at him? There's got to be a reason. Figure it out. Get him to tell you. In their process of tying him up, when it says they bound him with thongs, this means just straps, leather straps, and different things. Basically, they were just binding him to where he couldn't move. In the process of doing this, Paul, he says, and Paul said to the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? And basically, Paul says, hey, by the way, can you do this? Because to a Roman citizen that's been uncondemned in this? Basically, here he's implying and telling him, he says, I am a Roman citizen, and you cannot be doing these things to me by law. Under Roman rule, those that were a free Roman citizen had special privileges under the law. And there were certain things that protected the Roman citizens more so than others, and they're not allowed to treat them in this way. They're not allowed to do these things. They have to respect them. They have to work differently with them. And with Paul, he mentioned also this being uncondemned, in that there was not anything that had proved his guilt at this point. All it was there was a mob against him. There was no proof. There was no information. He had never been set on trial. Nothing had been done to prove that Paul was responsible for what had taken place, that Paul was responsible for anything. He was completely unjustified in this. So Paul uses the law of the land to his benefit. As we continue, verse 26, it says, "And when the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. And the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? And he said, Yea. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was freeborn." So the centurion goes to the chief captain and tells him, he says, Hey, we need to be careful what we do here. We need to be careful of the actions that we take place, because this guy, he's a Roman citizen. And we can't be doing these things. We could get in big trouble for this. So the chief captain goes to him and he says, Are you a Roman? This guy, he tells me that you said you were a Roman. Is that true? And Paul says, Yes, I am a Roman. And the chief captain says unto me, he says, I purchased my freedom. I bought it for a sum of money. And Paul, he tells him, he says, I was freeborn. There are two ways to becoming a Roman citizen, just as there are multiple ways to become a citizen in our country. You can be born a citizen, or you can acquire your citizenship. And the centurion, he was one that had bought his citizenship. But Paul tells him, he says, I am born of my citizenship. We don't know exactly how it was achieved for Paul, whether it was just because of the town that he lived in, or whether or not one of his parents, his father, was a citizen. But nonetheless, it tells him that he is born. Then verse 29 says, Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, for he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Chief captain is very much concerned with the way things have developed. He's very much so concerned with the way that he has treated Paul so far, and doesn't want it to get out that this has taken place. Doesn't want anybody else to find out that Paul was treated poorly. And then the following day, he sets it up. He knows that he needs to put Paul on trial, that we need to figure out what he's done. And so the chief priest, he tells the religious leaders, the chief priests and their council, he says, Hey, let's set up a time. We're going to meet together and we're going to have this trial, and you're going to be able to say what's going on here. We need to figure out if this man's actually guilty of anything. So he takes them and places them before them, or with them. Verse 23 says, And Paul earnestly beholding the council said, Men and brethren, I lived in all good conscience before God unto this day. We see Paul's opening statement here. He tells them, he says, all the way up until this time, I have lived in the will of God. He says, I have lived in all good conscience before God. There's not things that he has done that is wrong. And this is the thing we need to remember. What the Jews were accusing Paul of doing was going against the Lord and the Lord's law and the things that the Lord has. He was in their mind, he was doing all of these things that to them was blasphemy and was against the will of God. And Paul, he says, up until this point, to this day, I have always been following the will of God. I'm still doing it even today. I'm not who you say I am. We see in verse 2, it says, "And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth." Upon hearing this, the high priest Ananias, and just a little bit about him, through history we kind of find out this man, he only served for 12 years as a high priest and was basically removed from office because he was a very evil high priest. He did a lot of things that a high priest you would think shouldn't do. And he was very much so what we would consider to be a politician. I think even I read that he was even a Sadducee, which, as we talked about this morning, they were very much so politically minded. And even after being removed from office, you can actually still hold that title legally. And he, even after being removed from office as a high priest, still used his title to gain even more power and to serve himself more. This man was a very evil man. This is not what you would characterize as being a high priest. You know, when you think of a high priest, you think of somebody that's very respectable, someone that is, at the very least, religious, at least tries to act like they are a certain way. But Ananias, Ananias, he didn't even try. He was all about himself and what he wanted, and removed others. We are not told exactly why he commanded this to be to have Paul slapped. This basically is slapped in the. We would call it a slap in the face as well. It's basically telling him to be quiet, and it was also a bit of trying to think of the wording here. It's a lowering of character is the only thing I can think of. Basically, it was something to be ashamed of in it. But he commands this, and the reasons could have been just that he didn't like what Paul was saying. Could have been he just didn't like Paul and didn't want Paul to speak. Whatever the reason, so he commands this. And notice here verse 3, Paul responds. And it says, "Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after a law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest?" Excuse me. We see that after this takes place, Paul, he immediately pops off to the, I want to say pops off, he responds to Ananias, and he tells him, basically saying, "You have smitten me, you've hit me, but God is going to smite you for who you are." He tells him that you are a whited wall. Christ also referred to the Pharisees, other religious leaders, as whited sepulchres. That's the same thing that we're talking about here. It's basically, it was a grave, and they would make them to be very clean, and they would actually whitewash them every year to make them look very nice and wonderful and elaborate and clean. But on the inside, it housed a dead body. It's very dirty, very disgusting on the inside, and deadness. And Paul is telling him, you are a whited wolf. It was the same way. You're trying to be this person, you're trying to act like this person, you're trying to present yourself this way, but you're not. And you're going to answer to God for that. God's going to take care of you for this. Because you sit there and you say you are judging me after a law, but yet you commanded me to be smitten contrary to the law. You've commanded me to be slapped, to be hit for no reason at all, just because it fancies you. There's been nothing that I've been accused of up to this point. You just didn't like what I said. So you took action. And so you're going to answer to God for that. We see, though, it says in verse 4, and they that stood by said, revilest thou God's high priest? Those around, they said, how dare you speak that way to the high priest? And they call him, I find it interesting here that they call him God's high priest. This man was anything but God's high priest in the way that he was. Nonetheless, he had the position, he had the rank. And notice here what Paul says. It says, then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. We see after they say this, Paul, he says, oh, I didn't know this was the high priest. I didn't know that he was this position. There could have been many reasons for this. It could have been due to the quick nature of it being assembly. He may not have been wearing his clothes that would have recognized him as the high priest. Paul also, there is indication that he had problems with his vision. It could have been hard for him to see in the place that they're at. But I want us to notice here, this man Ananias, he is a crummy man. He's doing things that he shouldn't have been doing. Paul knew it. And yet, we see what he says. He says, I didn't know that was the position he held. I'm commanded by God's law to respect that position. You know, we've talked about this before, but even when somebody holds an office that is crummy as they can be, we're still commanded to respect the position, to act properly. And Paul recognizes us. Notice here, verse 6, it continues, but when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead I am called in question. And when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. We say Paul, at some point during this trial, we'll call it, he figures out that those that are there, they're not all of one religious group. There's some that are Pharisees and some that are Sadducees. And Brother Mike talked about this morning, but just as a refresher, the biggest difference, and the scripture even tells us here, that in verse 8 it says, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angels nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Basically, the Sadducees were very political in their nature, and they didn't believe in anything spiritual. I mean, pretty much everything to do with the spiritual nature of things, that didn't exist. They didn't believe in the resurrection, they didn't believe in angels, that's all done. Nothing. And the Pharisees were the exact opposite. And so Paul, he figures this out. He says, hey, I'm a Pharisee. I was raised by a Pharisee. And he even tells him, he says, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. He says, and the reason that I'm here today, guys, is because the hope and resurrection of the dead is being called into question here. Basically, he tells them, the reason I'm here is for the reason that the Pharisees is something the Pharisees believe in. He uses his position here to pin them against each other. Immediately, it causes a division to happen between them. They're no longer worried about Paul, they're worried about arguing between each other. And notice here in verse 9 it says, and when there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees part arose and strove, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God. We say that because of Paul's statement, the Pharisees, they come up and they say, well, we find no wrong in this guy. He's good. what he's teaching, we can't fight against that. And the angel spoke to him and gave him God's word. And, he believes in the resurrection as we do. Oh, that's all good. It's all fine and dandy. Of course, it doesn't tell us, but the Sadducees, they were totally against all of that. Probably still calling for his death. But you notice here that it quickly changes. It's no longer about Paul, it's about each other. In verse 10 it says, "And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled into pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle." Yep. From the chief priest's vision of this, I mean, he's probably like, I gotta rescue this guy again. Basically the fight has brewed again, and they're again trying to kill Paul. It says they're trying to pull him into pieces. And so he says, he sends the soldiers again, pull Paul out of it, and to stop it before he was killed. Probably more than likely remembering, this is a Roman, I need to make sure I take care of this guy. But we have this continually happening. They just get mad at him. See, verse 11 says, "In the night following, the Lord stood by him," of Paul, "and said, Be of good cheer, Paul. For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." We see in Paul's writing to the Romans that he expresses his desire to come and to minister to them one day. And it's something that's been throughout a good portion of his ministry, that Paul had the desire to go to Rome and to share the gospel, but never being given the opportunity. At this time, and probably being close to death, or at least knowing that people were out to kill him, it could be the time that is very troubling for Paul. And as well, as leading up to this, we saw that there were visions that were given to Paul and to others as well that were saying that things were going to be rough in Jerusalem. And he didn't know exactly what was going to take place, but he knew things were going to be really bad once he got there. At this point in time, Paul could have been thinking that his time was coming to a close. But we notice here that the Lord comes to him, says, "Be of good cheer. Be joyous, Paul." Because even though what's taking place here, just as you've preached here and you've testified here in Jerusalem, I'm going to give you the opportunity in Rome. I'm going to take you to Rome. And this is something that I talked about when and we're going to see as he gets to Rome, he gets to speak to a lot of people that, eventually he ends up standing before Caesar. He is involved with a lot of people that are very high up in the Roman hierarchy of things. And basically gets free travel to Rome as well. This is one of the things I mentioned when we were talking about people that were telling Paul, don't go, don't go, don't go. That can't be the best thing. But what we're actually going to see, and God tells Paul here, he says, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do something that you have yet to be able to do. Even though things are rough right now, even though things look bleak, I've got a plan for you. So trust in me. Follow me. By going to Jerusalem, Paul is going to be put in a position to minister to people that he never would have even got a chance to say one word to. Without going as a prisoner, he never would have made it before Caesar. He never would have made it before all of these very high ranking officials, and being around the area, there were many others that I'm sure he's going to be able to witness to in his day-to-day life at this time. And this is all because of his willingness to do something that on paper didn't really seem like a good idea. It seemed like it was the worst plan ever by God. And God says, no, I got this figured out. We can have peace in knowing that if we are in the Lord's plan, if we are following His path, that He's got it figured out. The Lord doesn't make bad plans. We make bad plans. But He understands how things work. He sees the big picture. He sees what we're going to be able to accomplish. So He says, be happy, Paul. Don't worry. You're going to get there. Message is over, and so the Lord leaves. Verse 12, it says, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40, which made this conspiracy. So, yet again, they missed their opportunity to reach Paul, and there's 40 men here. And they basically make a pact together. They say, we're not going to eat, we're not going to drink, we're not doing anything until we get to kill Paul. We're going to do it. So, they have their conspiracy, they have their plan even, they go to the chief priests in verse 14. And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore, ye with the council, signify the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though you would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him. They go to the chief priests and say, hey, we've made a pact, we're going to kill Paul for you. But here's what we need you to do. We need you call up the chief captain and tell him, hey, we need Paul to come down here so that we can figure things out. So that we can get this done right. And he says, and when they bring Paul down here, they're not going to be suspecting anything. So we're going to ambush him. And we'll kill him. All you got to do is ask him to come down. You know, as typical politicians, they jumped at this opportunity. Verse 16 says, and when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul the prisoner called me unto him and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee. Then the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, what is it that thou hast to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly. But do not yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath, that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him, and now they are ready, looking for a promise from thee. So the chief captain then let the young man depart, and charged him, see thou tell no man what thou hast showed these things, that thou hast showed these things unto me. We see that Paul's sister's son, he catches wind of this somehow. We don't know exactly how, but he hears about this and he goes and he tells Paul. And Paul, he calls over the centurion and he says, hey, this guy, he needs to tell the chief captain something. Please set him before him. So he goes and the centurion, he gets the boy or the man before the chief captain. But I want us to notice something here about this. Or think about something here. The centurion and the chief captain listened to Paul's request. When it comes to guards over prisons and the warden over the prison, or and this probably wasn't really like an actual prison, but like still, he's in bonds with these people. Both of them, with very little convincing, did exactly as Paul requested. Both of them. They didn't question it. They took it very seriously. We see as well that the chief captain, once he hears the story, he takes it very seriously. He doesn't go to Paul and ask, hey, what's going on? Is this real? He doesn't just kind of sweep it under the rug. He takes it very, very seriously. And it could have been the hand of the Lord, but what I think is much more likely is that it was due to Paul's character, due to the way that Paul led his life. And we know people that the way they live, the way they speak, the things that they do makes it very easy to trust them. Very easy to really listen to them. I believe wholeheartedly that the reason that these men were so quick to listen to Paul is because in this short amount of time, they had realized that Paul was probably a pretty decent guy. And somebody they needed to listen to. So I listened. The message is relayed. In verse 23, we see the response of the chief captain. It says, and he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, spearmen 200, and at the third hour of the night. And provide them beasts that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter after this manner: Claudius Lysidius, unto the most excellent governor, Felix sendeth greeting. This man had taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then I came with an army, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him before their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when I was told me how that the Jews laid in wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. See that upon hearing this, the chief captain, he calls 2 centurions to him, which was 2 captains over 100 men, each over 100 men. He says, take 200 soldiers, horsemen, spearmen, and go in the night, and take Paul, and take him to Felix, governor. And he sends this letter to the governor, and I want us to notice something here. It's kind of interesting about the way that he tells the story. A little bit of politics going on here. Notice here, he says, this man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then I came with an army, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. When did the chief captain figure out he was a Roman? After saving him. The chief captain says, I found out he was a Roman, and so I came to his rescue. A little bit of spinning on the truth there. I don't blame the guy, though, because that story is a lot better than I saved this guy, I was going to get information from him, and then I found out he was a Roman, so I kind of decided against that. But he also tells Felix, he says, and I went through the due diligence and put him before their council so that they could figure this out. And after putting it before them, they couldn't come up with any reason why he needed to be put to death, much less, they couldn't find any reason to have him in bonds, much less put to death. But they're still wanting to kill the guy. They're still wanting to do this. And so, I'm sending him to you to deal with. And I'm sending word to them and saying that they also have to go before you to figure this out. Verse 31, it says, and then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, he said, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. Say that the letter is delivered and he says, after hearing of his location, confirming his citizenship, he says, okay, I'm going to hear this. When your accusers come, we'll take care of it.